I do my best to try to divide my comments between those that I consider would be analytical and editorial. And so if I'm going to say something that I think is a bit editorial, I'll try to give you a heads up. But I'm going to try to keep the thrust of my comments analytical. I was hoping to discuss maybe 4 or 5 issues with you today. But again, I'm happy to sort of go off script if there are other issues that you want to discuss. I'd like to discuss Iran a little bit today, Iran's regional role, its relationship or rivalry with Israel in the region, and obviously the exciting developments happening internally there, particularly with respect to this civil society movement, which is basically encompassed this women, life, freedom slogan, which has sort of captured the imagination of many in Iran and also outside of Iran over the last 4 or 5 months. I'd also like to discuss the relationship between Israel and Iran, Israel and Russia, and perhaps the changing situation with respect to the Ukraine war and how that affects Israel's relationship with both Russia and Iran. And in particular, there's a Syria angle there, which we can discuss as well. Russia has been an incredibly important presence in the Middle East for the last decade. And one of the questions the Ukraine war raises is whether we're going to see a sunset on this unique decade of Russian influence in the Middle East, or whether it will continue. And I think it's a question, but there's a lot to unpack with respect to that question. I'm happy to explore that as well. Finally, an issue that I've been following closely is how the Ukraine war has affected some of the large energy producers in the Middle East, in particular the Gulf producers, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar on the gas side. And there have been some really incredible developments in that with respect to those issues, particularly with respect to how Europe relates to both the Gulf and the wider Eastern Mediterranean region. There's almost been a 180-degree shift in Europe's approach to both the Eastern Mediterranean and the Gulf as a result of the Ukraine war. And so there's a lot to discuss there as well. And finally, a related issue, but perhaps separate, is there have been some interesting developments very recently with respect to Lebanon. And for a long time, I think Russia has eyed developing Lebanese gas assets as a prize, something it really sought to be able to control and influence. And over the last 2 weeks, we've seen announcements that countries like Qatar, France, and Italy will be jointly investing in Lebanon's gas assets, which raises the question of whether Russia is really being pushed out and what that might mean for Russia and Russia's influence over Europe. So I think any and all of those issues I'm happy to explore. And obviously, Cynthia had raised to me earlier today the issue of change going on in Israel. There's been a lot of, you could say, political and social upheaval in Israel in recent months. I'm happy to discuss that as well. And let me also say something for just a minute. With respect, I'd like to say that my heartfelt empathy goes out to those in Turkey, Syria, and Lebanon who suffered from the massive earthquake that struck there. It was, I think the death toll now in Turkey is over 37,000, last I saw. We don't know what the numbers are in Syria, and aid effort to Syria is much more complicated because of the ongoing political situation there. And I'd just like to highlight something that one of my colleagues is involved in. He's put together a joint Israeli-Arab aid effort, which is geared at delivering aid to those most in need in Syria. In Turkey, it's a little bit easier to reach, and there's been much more government-directed aid towards supporting Turkey, but the situation in Syria is much more complicated. And so my colleague, along with some of his colleagues in the Arab world, particularly in Jordan, have started an effort And if someone will let me, I'll put in the chat sort of a landing page. If for those of you who would like to support this effort, you can read more about it. I think it's a unique effort of Israelis getting together with our neighbors and trying to help those in our region. I put it in the chat there for those of you who are interested in learning more about it. I'd like to begin, and I'm going to keep the rest of my remarks brief and then give you a chance to ask questions. By addressing the question of Iran and dividing it into really three issues. The first is Iran's regional role, which for Israel and many of Israel's new partners in the region is probably the most troubling. It's the notion that Iran has partners in Arab states across the region, as far south as Yemen, along Israel's northern borders in Syria and Lebanon, and its southern border in Gaza. The idea that it is heavily projecting influence in Iraq, in what Iran describes as a strategy of forward defense, in which it tries to deter its enemies far from its borders. It feels that this gives it strategic depth. But from the Israeli perspective and the perspective of some of Israel's neighbors, it's the notion that Iran is meddling or interfering or encroaching on the sovereignty of many countries in the region. That is the crux of a lot of the tension, and certainly in the tension between Iran and its neighbors in the Arab Gulf, but also between Israel and Iran as well. The relationship with Israel is extremely troubled because Israel and Iran have basically been at war in Syria now since 2012. It's in Israel for a long time. For many years, it was known as the campaign between the wars. I would say since 2017, 2018, that campaign has become much more overt. And I think it's escalated in recent months as Russia has withdrawn many of its military assets from Syria as a result of the Ukraine war. What Israel is most concerned about with Iran in Syria and Lebanon is that Israel believes that Iran is trying to North Koreanize its northern border, similar to the way the border between North Korea and South Korea. So North Korea has a huge number of conventional rockets that threaten the major population centers of South Korea, a relatively small country. Israel's concerned that Iran is building up hundreds of thousands of rockets in southern Lebanon and beginning to do so in southern Syria in an effort to deter Israel. Some in Israel's military refer to this as the North Koreanization of Israel's northern border. And there's also a sense that in Israel that Iran's working to encircle Israel. It has partners in Gaza, it has partners in Lebanon and Syria, and it is actively working to develop partners in the West Bank. And so Israel is very much concerned that Iran, through its partners on its borders, will encircle it. And finally, the last issue, which is perhaps the most intriguing and the one in which I think I'd like to be humble in sort of commenting on, because I think for those of us who are outside of Iran's borders, it's really the rapidly evolving situation there is somewhat opaque. But it seems clear that the protests that have erupted have largely been led and generated by women who were fed up, I suppose, with the regime and with some of the patriarchal structures that were imposed by the regime on Iranian women, have sort of catalyzed or triggered a nationwide protest movement against the regime, which is, in character, it's quite clear that they're not seeking to reform the regime, or at least large numbers of the protesters. They're seeking to change the regime, which is a significant difference in the character of the protests we've seen in Iran over the last decade. There have been protests in Iran, major protests in Iran in 2017, 2018, again in 2018, 2019. and this goes back almost to the Green Revolution in Iran, which was a protest movement that erupted after their election in 2009. And the difference, I would say, the qualitative difference between the protests that we've seen over the last decade, going back to 2009, and these protests is in each of the major waves of protest over the last decade, there were protests led by certain narrow segments of the Iranian society, whether it was the workers or a geographic segment like Khuzestan, because they were angry they weren't getting clear water in southwest Iran, which is largely populated by Arabs and therefore felt marginalized, or whether it was in the 2009 Green Revolution, sort of Iran's upper middle classes who felt fed up with the political system. There wasn't really a cross-class coalition or even cross-geography coalition that emerged. And what we're seeing now is different in the sense that the protests have really erupted all over Iran. Certainly there have been places where the violence has been between the regime and the protesters has been more intense, and those places have been on the periphery, in places like Baluchistan and Kurdistan, the Baluchistan and Kurdistan parts of Iran, which are largely the periphery and the ethnic minority portions of Iran. But I would say there has been somewhat of a cross-class coalition that's participated in these protests, and that's really interesting. And what we've seen in these protests that we haven't seen in years past is are waves of strikes. Various sectors of society have engaged in nationwide strikes against the regime. Truckers have gone on strike. The bazaris, meaning many of the local merchants in major Iranian cities, have shut down sort of markets. The oil workers have gone on strike, which would have, if they do that on a sustained and continuous basis, would have a massive impact on the country. So we're seeing characteristics that we haven't really seen in Iran since Iran had its last revolution in 1978-79. And I don't want to draw comparisons, and I'm not saying that we're going to see the regime overthrown. I think it's really impossible to know where this stops or and how it ends. But I think what is interesting is, I think what we can say with some degree of confidence is there is a critical mass of Iranians who are fed up with the regime and would like to see substantial change and not just reform. And I think that that's worth watching very closely, again, with some degree of analytical modesty. I think I'll stop there and let your questions be my guide for the remainder of my comments. I'd like to hear from you, and I'd like to try to address what you're interested in hearing about.
Thanks a lot, Brandon. We already have quite a few great questions in the chat. We'll handle those, Brandon, and we'll feed them to you as we go. I think we're all really curious to learn a lot more about the intersection of the politics of Russia's war on Ukraine with broader questions of politics in the Middle East, but also, of course, these kinds of questions about Middle Eastern politics itself, the challenges of authoritarianism and democracy there. Let's start, though, with the war, and let's start with the question, I think maybe of arms supplies a little bit before perhaps moving on to other questions about oil and trade and things like that as well. On the one hand, we've seen Iran become something of an alternate supplier to reinforce Russian supplies of missiles and especially drones that have been used to attack Ukrainian civilian energy infrastructure. And on the other hand, we've seen a relative reluctance on the part of Israel to support Ukraine in the war. And so I'm wondering, and in part I'm drawing here on a question that Terry Quist put in the chat right as we started, but I was wondering if you could talk about each of these just a little bit in turn, why Iran is providing the support to Russia that it is, what to your understanding that support entails, what impacts that support has not only on the war, but also within Iran and within the Middle East, and sort of what role it's playing there. And then, maybe turn for a bit to Israel as well, and why have they, on the contrary, been so reluctant to become involved in the war? What's the state of play in that regard in Israel at the present moment, and the impacts that this has, within Israel, within Israeli politics itself. So I know it's a lot there, but just to get your feedback a little bit on sort of the interaction of some of this with the war that's going on.
Sure, Steve. Those are all really important questions. Just remind me if I miss any of them in sort of trying to address them. Let me begin by saying that as a historian, one of the interesting dimensions of Iran supplying weapons to Russia is that, for 200 years, we sort of watched the West provide the Middle East with weapons. And certainly during the Cold War, that was one of the big dimensions of the East-West competition in the region, was as weapon suppliers to the respective blocs or those who were identifying with either the Soviets or were claiming to be non-aligned, and those identified with the West. Now we're seeing weapons flowing from the Middle East to Europe and Russia, meaning Iran supplying Russia. We've seen in Israel new European outreach and interest in Israeli air defense systems to cope potentially with threats coming from Russia to Europe. And so the notion all of a sudden, or that the Ukraine war has transformed the flow of weapons from Europe and Russia to the Middle East, and now it's going from the Middle East to Europe and Russia. And I think as a historian, that's tremendously interesting. The Russia-Iran partnership, I'll give you sort of the bottom line. They've been partners fighting together to prop up the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria since the Syrian uprising that erupted in 2011. And they've worked fairly closely, and so they have a tight relationship that's basically unfolded between 2011 and the Ukraine war. And I think that from that relationship was born this new weapon supply deal that delivers sort of the killer drones, what's known as the Shahed 136, to Russia. Now the Iranians are helping the Russians build their own manufacturing capability so they can make their own Shahed 136 on Russian territory, maybe a modified version that will allow it to carry a larger payload and maybe fly a little bit further. Which, by the way, from the Israeli perspective, is in violation of UN Security Council Resolution 2231 that was part of the Iran nuclear deal. But it's not just the killer drones. The Iranians are also supplying Russia with the Mohajer 6, which is a combat unmanned aerial combat aircraft that can deliver provides very serious attack capability. And so those are the two major Iranian weapon supplies to Russia in the Ukraine war. One of the things, obviously, that concerns Israel tremendously is the notion, and it's been discussed, but so far we haven't seen any movement on it, is that Iran would provide Russia with short-range ballistic missiles. And this obviously would be a new elevation in the relationship, I think, and I think something worth noting, and something that should be of serious concern. That would also actually be in violation of UN Resolution 2231, part of the Iran nuclear deal. But that provision of the deal is expected to expire next year, or at the end of this year, really. And so there is a scenario where Iran would feel entitled to do that and not incur or have to provide any excuse in terms of international law with respect to that issue. So I think that the partnership arises out of the relationship in Syria. I just want to make a point about the limits of that relationship. There is a great degree of suspicion, both past and present, that's built into the Russian-Iranian relationship. Russia was one of the two major imperial powers that dominated Iran in its modern history since 1800. In particular, there were two humiliating treaties that Russia made Iran sign in the first half of the 19th century, the Treaty of Gulistan, the Treaty of Turkmenchai. And this might sound esoteric to many of you, and that's perfectly fine, but to Iranians, it's something that's very much part of their living, active political discourse. And I'll just give you one example of it. During the Syrian war, at one point, the Iranian regime granted Russia the right to use one of its air force bases in the city of Hamadan to launch sorties to attack regime enemies in Syria. And this created a huge, massive outrage in the domestic political sphere in Iran amongst the parliamentarians. Iran does have a parliament, that, Iran was allowing an imperial power to use its territory, again, something that the revolution had promised it would never allow to happen. And when the Islamic Republic of Iran was created in 78, 79. And so I think there is very much an institutional and political memory in Iran of being dominated by Russia. And I think that while the relationship is being driven right now by realpolitik, and I think it's a very important one for both sides, there is a certain amount of discomfort that I would say is mutual, and it's important to keep that in mind. If I can now, I'll try to answer the Israeli side of the issue. What explains Israel's reluctance to support Ukraine? In recent weeks, Israel's new government has been under an immense amount of pressure from the Americans to change its policy, to get off the fence, so to speak. And this resulted, our Israeli Foreign Minister Eli Cohen was recently in the Ukraine, making a very public, visible visit to show support for the Ukraine government. And I think that this was an attempt to sort of relieve some of the American pressure on this new Israeli government to say, hey, look, we're supporting Ukraine. But I think that the reality of it is that Israel is going to, in particular, our new old prime minister is going to try to walk a very delicate tightrope in Israel's policy towards the Ukraine war, and I'll explain to you why. And I see the question in the chat. The Russian Jewish community is a part of it, but I would say it's a much less important part than you might think. The core of Israel's reluctance to side more strongly with Ukraine than it has so far has to do with the fact that Russia is our neighbor and has been for the last 10 years. Russia controls, or has controlled up until recently, most of southwest Syria, which is along Israel's northern border. It is Russia that has mainly played an important role in helping Israel manage the Iranian, you could say, the Iranian effort to open a new front against Israel in Syria. And as Israel carries out airstrikes in Syria against the Iranian forces there on a regular basis at various junctures, which it's done for the last decade, every time it's done so, it has, particularly in areas where there may be Russian assets or troops, Israel has to deconflict with Russian forces, which means Israel has to pick up the phone. That's just a fancy word for saying Israel picks up the phone and lets Russia know where and when it's going to be attacking, to make sure that Israel doesn't strike or kill or attack any Russians in its effort to target Iranians. And that means that in a very important sense, Russia controls Syria's airspace for Israel. And Israel doesn't want to be in a position, by siding with Ukraine overtly, providing Ukraine with offensive weapons to be used against Russia, that Russia would then make Israel's life much, much more difficult in Israel's ability to wage its war against Iran and Syria. A secondary consideration that was raised by a former Netanyahu national security advisor is that Israel's concerned that weapon systems like the Iron Dome, which Ukraine has expressed interest in, which is an air defense system, a short-range air defense system, Israel's concerned that if it provides that Ukraine, or Nagel, who was Netanyahu's former national security, one of Netanyahu's former national security advisors, had made the argument that if Israel provided Ukraine with the Iron Dome and Russia was able to capture the Iron Dome, then Russia would transfer that technology to Iran, and that would be a national security risk or threat to Israel. And therefore, Israel needs to be very careful about the kinds of systems that it supplies to the Ukraine. And my impression is that we wouldn't have seen that argument made in public by someone like Yaakov Nagel if it wasn't what the prime minister was sort of thinking to a certain degree. So in a bottom line as to why Israel's position towards Russia and the Ukraine war hasn't been more towards Ukraine, it's because of Israel's interests along its northern border in Syria and Lebanon to a certain degree.
Thanks so much, Brandon. I'm sure there's a bunch of follow-up questions. I mean, I myself was just intrigued that you didn't once mention any kind of personal relationship like between Netanyahu and Putin, which I thought, like, at least in the past, was really, something advertised in the media. But I just want to switch the conversation again. I hope that it could be continued, but just initially to questions of oil. I know one of the readings that you asked us to take a look at talked about this odd new emerging alliance or maybe marriage of convenience between Russia and Saudi Arabia, and one that's been kind of very explicit, like for instance, after Russia's invasion, Saudi Arabia, as sort of a key player in OPEC, like refused to raise production limits, right? I mean, and like showed a very overt determination to kind of keep oil prices high. But I was just wondering if you could also comment on something. I mean, you've mentioned to me in the past that there's also like sort of more illicit arrangements going on. I mean, we've tried to focus in previous weeks on sanctions and whether or not they're effective. And I know that there's at least a lot of chatter about the extent to which Russia has been able to get around like barriers on like getting its oil and gas on the global markets. And I was just wondering if you could, cast some light on that issue for us.
Sure. It's a really interesting issue. The whole weaponization of energy in the war, both from the buyer and the seller's perspective, right? This sort of Western effort to put a price cap on it is very interesting, on the price of oil, and limit what Russia can sell its oil at is also scaring a lot of people in the region for fear that there will be a buyer's cartel in response to a seller's cartel. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take a couple steps back. And by the way, the question of Russia's sanctions and how it's getting around them is an interesting one, because I failed to mention it when I talked about Iran and Russia, but I think one of the things that Russia's hoping Iran can help them with is, Iran has lived with Western sanctions since the Islamic Republic of Iran was created, and has a lot of knowledge about how to deal with those sanctions and how to work around them to the extent that that's possible. And I think that Russia is hoping to learn from the Iranians and at least perhaps join forces with them in certain areas. And I think that that's driving another driver in terms of the Russia-Iranian relationship. In terms of the Gulf producers and Russia, there are two tactics that we're seeing in terms of Russian oil that may be helping Russia get around some of those sanctions, the Western sanctions. One is, I think what we're seeing in the Gulf is something that they call nativizing Russian oil. So they'll buy Russian oil, they'll blend it with their own oil, and then relabel it, right? It'll be Kuwaiti oil or Saudi oil. And then what ostensibly was Russia oil will go out to market, with a portion of it being Saudi oil, probably the large lion's share of it being Russian oil, but it will be it will be marketed under the Gulf label, right? So I think that's one tactic. And and a lot of that, and then the second element is a tactic that we first saw Iran use, in particular in selling its oil to China when Iran was coming under heavy sanctions from Europe in terms when there was basically a European embargo on Iranian oil. What Iran would do was sell its oil to Malaysia, and then, ostensibly the oil would be offloaded from a Malaysian ship to a Chinese ship, or to a ship, a non-Chinese flag ship, and then it would somehow make its way to China.